I can tell you that the number one problem in Hollywood was and is and always will be pedophilia. That's the biggest problem for children in this industry.
What if the greatest threat to child safety wasn't hiding in the shadows, but standing in the spotlight? For decades, Hollywood has faced mounting allegations of abuse, cover-ups, and silence. Yet each expose fades while the machine rolls on. Laws change, movements rise, but the most powerful names remain untouched. Then came Corey Feldman, a former child star turned whistleblower who claims to hold the names of Hollywood's most evil actors. His story sounds impossible, until you realize it might be true. And what he's about to reveal could shatter the industry's most guarded secrets. Fade in on a freckle-faced boy with oversized glasses, grinning under studio lights. The 1980s loved Corey Feldman. He was everywhere. Stand By Me, The Goonies, The Lost Boys, the kind of precocious charm Hollywood couldn't manufacture fast enough. But behind that grin was a boy standing too close to something toxic. And long before he found the words to say it, Feldman was already carrying secrets that no child should understand. Corey Feldman entered the industry as a child actor, part of a wave of preteen talent churned out by casting agencies and child star coaches. But unlike many of his peers, Feldman's exposure wasn't just to fame, it was to a darker, unspoken hierarchy that thrived behind the scenes. He was 8 years old when he booked his first national commercial. By 12, he was a millionaire. By 13, he had already been introduced to cocaine. There was no manual for surviving Hollywood as a child, especially not in the 1980s, when the industry's obsession with youth was reaching grotesque levels, and the protective oversight of guardians or unions was often nothing more than a legal smokescreen. Feldman later claimed that while audiences saw a fresh-faced prodigy, he was being passed from one powerful man to another. He wouldn't name them, not yet, but he would say this: they were the people you're supposed to trust, the ones in charge. There were signs, strange sleepovers with much older men, a growing dependence on drugs. Years later, when the world asked why he hadn't spoken out earlier, Feldman would recount being warned, explicitly, about what would happen if he did. His career would vanish. His reputation would implode. He would be blackballed, sued, or worse. Even as his fame grew, Corey Feldman was becoming a prisoner of something larger than himself. On red carpets, he was all jokes and energy. Off camera, he was often alone, drifting between film sets, hotel rooms, and the mansions of powerful benefactors. His parents were absent, his mother abusive, his father his manager, and the industry took full advantage of that vacuum. Decades later, he'd say it out loud: pedophilia has been the biggest problem for children in Hollywood. But back then, he was just another child star, high on attention, low on protection. He would grow up fast, and not by choice. There's a reason so many child stars vanish by adulthood. Some burn out, some walk away, others, like Feldman, stay, but come back different, wiser, louder, angrier, and in Corey Feldman's case, determined to name names, but not before the system tried to destroy him first. They were the perfect package: Corey Feldman and Corey Haim, two teen idols with floppy hair, irreverent charm, and a chemistry that felt electric on screen. The two Coreys became shorthand for a specific kind of pop culture magic: irreverent, rebellious, and heartbreakingly young. But their friendship, like their fame, was built on fractured ground. In 1987, The Lost Boys turned them into legends. They weren't just co-stars, they were brothers in every sense, but blood. What no one knew then was how deeply that bond was shaped by shared trauma. According to Feldman, both boys were being abused by different predators, but within the same system. Corey Haim, he later revealed, was raped on a film set at the age of 11. Feldman didn't learn the details until years later, but he recognized the signs: the spiraling behavior, the sudden silences, the desperate clinging to drugs and older men. Off-screen, the two Coreys were unraveling. They spent their teen years surrounded by enablers, agents, assistants, directors, many of whom either ignored the warning signs or were complicit in the abuse. The industry liked them better when they were high and quiet, cleaned up for interviews, shuffled off to the next shoot. By the early 1990s, the pair were tabloid fodder, arrests, rehab stints, public meltdowns, but their bond endured. Twisted by addiction and codependence, yes, but unbreakable in its origin. Both had been used. Both had been discarded. In private, they talked about it, about the people they feared, the names they couldn't say. Feldman later described these conversations as trauma circles, raw and cyclical, never truly resolved. "We knew," he said. "We just didn't know what to do." When they reunited in 2007 for a reality show, it wasn't just a comeback, it was an exorcism. On camera, Haim confronted Feldman for not protecting him. Feldman, stunned, deflected. But the pain was real. So was the shared history. "I was raped," Haim said, during a particularly raw moment. The cameras kept rolling. Within 3 years, Corey Haim would be dead. Corey Feldman's campaign against abuse in Hollywood was never quiet, but it was persistently ignored. From the moment he began to speak, the media reacted with derision. Late-night shows mocked him. Tabloids labeled him erratic. News anchors raised skeptical brows. He was portrayed as unstable, paranoid, washed up, a punchline in the same town that once made him a star. But behind those smirking headlines was a man laying a minefield of truth. And whether Hollywood wanted to or not, it would eventually have to reckon with what he had to say. In 2013, Feldman published Choreography, his memoir. What was meant to be a career retrospective became something far more incendiary, a Molotov cocktail hurled directly at Hollywood's glass walls. Beneath the nostalgia of movie sets and coming-of-age tales was a horrifying pattern: abuse, complicity, and silence. He wrote of being molested by men in positions of power, of watching Corey Haim, his closest friend and fellow child star, be exploited again and again, of trying to speak up and being threatened into submission. But most chilling was his depiction of a network, a web of predators embedded within the industry, still operating, still protected. He didn't name names, not then. Legal threats loomed. Libel laws in California were tight. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone, what the consequences of direct accusation could be. Still, the details he provided were disturbingly specific. Descriptions, job titles, places, habits, enough that readers began to connect the dots. And so did the men he was referring to. Soon after the book's release, Retaliation followed. Feldman received death threats. His home was swatted by police. An increasingly common and dangerous form of harassment meant to terrorize. Anonymous calls warned him to stop. Emails arrived with veiled threats. He told the police. They shrugged. The public, fed a diet of ridicule and half-truths, watched from a distance. They saw a man spiraling on morning television, dressed in black robes, talking about angels and demons. They heard him describe his life in spiritual terms: light versus darkness, good versus evil. To many, it seemed like delusion, a mind unraveling under pressure. But beneath the eccentricity was a message that could not be clearer. Hollywood protects its monsters, not just with money, not just with non-disclosure agreements, but through a far more effective tool: collective silence. And Feldman wasn't trying to make noise. He was trying to shatter that silence. He begged for help. He launched crowdfunding campaigns to hire security teams after the threats escalated. He reached out to journalists, pitched exposés, and asked producers to back his efforts. Most turned him down. Too risky, too vague, too unbelievable. The fear wasn't that he was lying, it was that he might be telling the truth. Because if he was right, it would force the entire industry to confront its most shameful secrets. But Feldman never wavered in his belief. He knew others like him existed, victims now grown, living quiet lives in fear or shame. And when he spoke, they nodded, silently, anonymously. A quiet confirmation from those too afraid or too exhausted to speak up themselves. Still, he held the names close. Not out of fear, he said, but out of strategy. He believed timing mattered. He believed the truth, once fully revealed, needed to be undeniable. But time was running out, because somewhere in Hollywood, the men he'd described were watching, waiting, and wondering just how long the truth could stay buried. For years, Corey Feldman walked a razor's edge, saying enough to make headlines, but not enough to spark legal war. The public begged for names. So did reporters, victims, skeptics, and lawyers. But Feldman always stopped just short. He had his reasons. Because naming them, really naming them, wasn't just risky. It was dangerous. He claimed that multiple attorneys had warned him, identify anyone with power and you'll be sued into silence. Or worse, Hollywood wasn't just a city. It was a fortress. A world where publicists, lawyers, and executives formed an invisible network of protection around the elite. And Feldman had already been marked as a threat. But behind closed doors, he kept a list. He'd been building it for decades. When he finally prepared to reveal the names, he made a choice that puzzled even his supporters. Rather than hand the list to a newspaper or DA's office, Feldman decided to make a film, My Truth, The Rape of Two Coreys, a self-funded documentary, one live screening, one shot to say everything. The date, March 9, 2020. The rollout was chaotic. The live stream crashed. Viewers were locked out. Conspiracies swirled. Was it sabotage, technical failure, or something darker? Feldman insisted it had been hacked, that someone wanted to stop the names from going public, but they came out anyway. On screen, Feldman named several men. A former child talent manager who had worked with dozens of young actors. A nightclub owner Feldman said had targeted multiple boys. An assistant on Feldman's films who had abused him on set. And, most shockingly, a once-beloved actor, Corey Haim's alleged rapist. The crowd gasped. Twitter exploded. But the mainstream press barely flinched. No follow-ups, no investigations, no arrests. The men Feldman accused denied everything. One lawyer called it a desperate act from a broken man. Another threatened immediate legal action. But something strange happened in the aftermath. The names faded. The industry kept moving. Shows went on. Awards were handed out. The accused stayed largely untouched. Feldman, on the other hand, became more isolated than ever. The question hung in the air like smoke. What happens when the truth isn't enough? There had always been rumors. In green rooms, on casting couches, in backlot trailers and makeup chairs, whispers passed between extras, agents, and assistants. A code of silence wrapped in fear and paychecks. Hollywood's dark history with abuse wasn't new. It wasn't hidden either. You just had to listen. Former child stars began speaking out, quietly, in podcasts or memoirs. Elijah Wood hinted at vipers circling young actors. Todd Bridges spoke of being molested on set. Even Macaulay Culkin, Feldman's longtime friend, dropped cryptic lines about the industry's underbelly. But none of them lit the fuse the way Feldman did. That's what made him so dangerous. Because Corey wasn't hinting. He was shouting, naming, pointing. The people he accused weren't minor players. They were connected, deeply. Some had worked with Disney, others with Nickelodeon. Some still managed talent, still attended parties, still accepted into the fold. And that's where the real sickness lived, not just in the crimes, but in the comfort of the perpetrators. Former assistants recounted seeing things. Young boys ushered into private offices, odd mentorships that blurred lines. There were NDAs, payoffs, quiet firings without explanation. One former child actor, speaking anonymously, said, "There's a list. Everyone in the industry knows, but no one wants to touch it." When An Open Secret, a 2014 documentary about child abuse in Hollywood, was released, it barely made a ripple. Studios wouldn't touch it. Distributors pulled out. Sponsors disappeared. That was the real power Feldman was up against. Not just abusers, but an entire culture built to protect them. He wasn't the only voice, but he was the loudest and the most relentless. And maybe that's why they came for him. After Feldman released his documentary, he expected a reckoning. Instead, he got retaliation. Within days, online trolls flooded his pages. Death threats escalated. Anonymous calls increased. He claimed his home security was breached. His car was tampered with. He went on live television and broke down, insisting there were powers trying to silence him. Then came the knife attack. In March 2018, 2 years before the documentary aired, Feldman said he was stabbed in his car by a man who had jumped out of another vehicle. The wound was minor. The police found no clear evidence. Critics mocked the story. But Feldman was convinced it had been a warning. "They're watching," he said. "They're everywhere." Friends distanced themselves. Sponsors backed out. Journalists stopped calling. And that was the most effective silencing of all. The slow erasure. Not through violence, but through ridicule. The industry didn't need to discredit Corey Feldman. They just had to let him burn out. Let the story slip into the conspiracy pile, somewhere between UFOs and QAnon. But those close to him knew the toll. They watched him spiral. Paranoia, anxiety, constant fear. He hired private security, carried weapons, refused to be alone. All while the men he accused kept working, kept smiling for cameras, kept receiving lifetime achievement awards. It wasn't just a story of abuse. It was a story of survival in a place designed to protect predators. And as Feldman's voice grew hoarser, lonelier, more erratic, the question deepened. What happens when a man screams the truth into a world that won't listen? And how long before he stops screaming altogether? Corey Feldman was no longer an actor. Not really. He had become something else. A crusader, a symbol, a cautionary tale. Depending on who you asked, he was either a delusional attention seeker or the only one brave enough to break Hollywood's oldest pact: silence. He wasn't content with just a memoir or a documentary. Feldman wanted an army. He launched a campaign called Truth 222, referencing a spiritual calling he believed came from a higher power. He toured radio shows, podcasts, red carpets, and television interviews, often breaking down mid-sentence, haunted by memories he could never fully exorcise. He was tired of hints. He wanted laws changed, protections enacted, statutes of limitations abolished. But each move forward came with a cost. Former colleagues stopped returning his calls. Networks blacklisted him. Studios labeled him too risky. Even some victims who had once confided in him distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. And still, he pushed. He released music, angry, raw, often ridiculed by critics who missed the subtext. He formed a band, Corey's Angels, which many dismissed as a vanity project, but was, in his words, a safe space for women who had been damaged by the industry. Even that spun in the press as a cult-like spectacle. Nothing Feldman did could escape mockery. That was the most brilliant tactic of his enemies. They didn't need to disprove him. They just needed to make him a joke. But the footage kept surfacing. The stories kept lining up. The patterns undeniable. There was no studio behind him, no PR team, just a former child star screaming into the void, begging someone, anyone, to believe him. And sometimes, that desperation was all people saw. Somewhere, in a locked case, lies a document that Corey Feldman claims he prepared in the event of my death. It's not a will. It's not a farewell letter. It's a list, a chilling ledger of alleged abusers, complete with names, dates, locations, and details that he says would, if released, expose the rot at the heart of Hollywood. Feldman says it's real. He says he's been protecting it for years. He says it's his insurance policy because, in his words, if something happens to me, I want the truth to survive. But the truth doesn't wait. Time keeps moving. laws remain unchanged. The outrage that once surged when he first spoke out has settled into something far more dangerous: indifference. His voice, once loud, raw, and impossible to ignore, has become a faint echo. He's shouted the same warnings for decades, and still, the world prefers distraction over confrontation, scandal over substance, headlines over history. And Feldman? He's not the only one with a list. There are others: survivors, former child actors, assistants, extras, choreographers, makeup artists, people who saw things, heard things, knew things. They pass names in whispers, on online forums, in trauma support groups, at therapy retreats, or anonymous meetups. The same names appear over and over, some still working, some celebrated, some teaching acting classes or mentoring the next generation. But the lists never reach daylight. Why? Because Hollywood doesn't just silence whistleblowers, it replaces them. For every Corey Feldman, there's another fresh-faced kid ready to be discovered, another desperate parent willing to sign the contract, another agent happy to look the other way. The machine never stops. It just finds new parts. And the names on Feldman's list? They aren't fading. They're blending in. At charity galas, where they smile beside victims of the very crime they once committed. On studio lots, where they supervise new projects and shake hands with interns. On executive boards, where they decide which stories get told and which stay buried. In mentorship programs, where they give back by guiding young, hopeful performers through the same doors they once used to exploit. That's the true horror. Not that monsters exist in Hollywood, but that they no longer have to hide. They've been grandfathered into the culture, insulated by legacy, protected by time, and washed clean by the public's selective memory. Because when the truth is too ugly to face, the world does something easier. It forgets. Feldman's document remains locked away. Maybe it will surface someday. Maybe it won't. Maybe someone else will open it. Or maybe, by then, the names will already be in the credits of your favorite show. And maybe you'll never even notice. Because monsters in Hollywood don't lurk in shadows. They walk red carpets. By 2022, Corey Feldman was almost completely cut off from the industry that had made and broken him. The offers stopped. The auditions dried up. Once, casting directors had fought to place him on screen. Now, his name brought hesitation, discomfort, risk. He had become radioactive, too controversial for networks, too unpredictable for producers, too real for a system built on illusion. The press, once fascinated by his every move, slowly moved on. He was no longer headline material, unless it was a joke at his expense. The documentaries he had poured himself into vanished into digital libraries, buried beneath algorithmic recommendations for true crime and trending dramas. His story, his pain, reduced to a thumbnail most people scrolled past. Left in the wreckage were unpaid legal bills, abandoned collaborators, and a fan base more interested in 80s nostalgia than in uncomfortable truths. They wanted to remember the Goonies, not confront the rot behind it. They wanted the fun, the adventure, the one-liners, not the man standing alone on a stage crying into a mic about predators and power. He still performed, occasionally, at small venues, county fairs, indie clubs with sticky floors and dim lights. His band, Corey's Angels, came and went. He'd sing, he'd dance, but always, inevitably, he'd talk. About justice, about trauma, about lost childhoods and broken promises. Some fans clapped. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they were watching a performance or a confession. Every few months, rumors flared across social media. Corey Feldman was going to name more names. This time, it was real. This time, the truth would break through. But the names never came. Or if they did, they were met with indifference. Legal threats followed. Lawsuits loomed. The world no longer seemed interested. And maybe that's what broke him the most. Not the abuse, not the betrayal, not even the predators who walked free, but the silence. He had spent decades preparing for the moment he could finally expose the truth. Years of collecting memories, testimonies, threats. Years of battling addiction, paranoia, and ridicule. He believed, truly, that when he finally spoke the full truth, the world would listen, that something would change, that justice would prevail, that his suffering would mean something. But there were no arrests, no sweeping investigations, no public outrage, just a brief murmur online, and then silence. The justice system didn't come to his aid. The media didn't circle back. The industry didn't flinch. Just silence. And in that silence, Corey Feldman began to disappear. Not all at once, but in pieces. He became harder to reach. His interviews fewer and farther between. His social media quieter. The smile, the spark, the defiance, it dulled. Because shouting into a void eventually changes you. And when the world refuses to listen long enough, even the loudest voice begins to fade. And that, perhaps, is the most brutal betrayal of all. Not when the monster wins, but when no one cares that it ever existed. Corey Feldman is still alive, still talking, still fighting, but the battle has changed him. The boy who once made the world laugh with Goonies jokes and vampire hunts is now a man hollowed by war. A war he never chose, but one that chose him. He didn't want to be the face of Hollywood's most disturbing truth. He didn't want to spend decades chasing justice that never came. He wanted to act, to entertain, to live. But fate had other plans. When Feldman first began to speak openly about the abuse he and his friend Corey Haim endured, he imagined a tidal wave of support, a reckoning, headlines, arrests, change. Instead, what he met was resistance, skepticism, laughter, even from those who had once stood beside him. Because the world loves its heroes clean, not broken. It loves its icons quiet, not angry. And Feldman was both broken and angry. He cried out in books, in interviews, on live television. He raised money for documentaries. He begged for legal reform. He named names. And every time, he was met with the same cold silence, a shrug, a smirk, a shift in the conversation. He was too strange, they said, too dramatic, too erratic. But what they refused to see, what they chose not to see, was that he was a man drowning in a truth too heavy to carry alone. Today, the world claims it's ready to confront abuse. There are movements, hashtags, lawsuits, high-profile trials. But the names Corey Feldman tried to expose, the men he says preyed on children behind closed doors, they remain largely untouched. They appear on panels. They accept lifetime achievement awards. They're shielded not just by money or lawyers, but by nostalgia, by the unwillingness of a culture to believe that its most beloved stories were built on silent suffering. Feldman's greatest tragedy isn't what was done to him. It's what happened after he spoke. He stood in front of cameras and revealed the ugliest truths of the industry that raised him. He offered receipts, stories, connections. He put his safety, his reputation, and his remaining career on the line. And still, the world looked away. The industry he called out never apologized, never admitted, never changed. And maybe that's the cruelest truth of all. Because if a man spends his entire life telling the truth, and the world shrugs, if he sacrifices everything just to be believed, and still isn't, then what's left? Was he ever really heard? Or was he just another boy lost in the machine, discarded once he stopped being useful, erased once he started telling the truth? There are no credits, no applause, no neat endings, only silence. and the sound of a voice still trying, against all odds, to be heard. Cut to black. If the truth has finally been spoken, will we choose to listen? Or let silence protect the powerful once again? The next chapter depends on what we do now, while we still can. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.